History 1. I went on a trip to Oregon, a place I'd dreamt of visiting since I was a kid. My plan was to spend time in Portland and explore the city, but I figured a camping trip in the vast forests of Oregon would be a nice addition. I intended to camp for just one night and then return to the city. I'd been camping a few times before, but never alone, so this was a new experience. I rented some camping gear from a local shop and found a small trail with camping grounds. I drove down there, setting off at sunrise, and reached the camping spot in less than 3 hours. The site was essentially a flat piece of land with signs of previous campers' VJ old equipment, rusty cooking pots, and some trash. I set up my tent next to a tree where the area was clear. As far as I knew, there weren't any special attractions nearby, so I was just there to relax and enjoy the peace. At sunset, I started a fire and took out a Ziploc bag filled with s'mores ingredients. I made more s'mores than I could eat, and then I just sat by the campfire, lost in thought. Suddenly, I was interrupted by a man who appeared out of nowhere and sat at the other end of my campfire. "Oh, hey, are you camping around here too?" I asked, trying to ease the awkwardness. He looked at me but didn't respond. I glanced around to see if anyone else was nearby, but it was just us. After a moment, he stood up and walked away. I was left feeling a mix of nervousness, confusion, and unease, but I stayed put, keeping my eyes open for the next hour. Eventually, I put out the fire and went into my tent, staying awake for another hour before finally falling asleep. In the middle of the night, I woke to the sound of a crackling campfire. I opened my eyes and saw an orange light flickering outside my tent. My heartbeat quickened as I unzipped the tent to find my campfire rekindled, and 4 men sitting around it, all staring directly at me. One of them was the same man who'd visited earlier. I stepped out of the tent, looking at each of them in horror. Before I could speak, one of them said something in a foreign language, and 2 of them got up, grabbed me and patted me down, taking my phone and wallet. These guys were much bigger than me, and there was no point in resisting. After a thorough search, they dragged me away from the campsite. We walked for about 20 minutes into the woods. I was on the verge of tears, convinced this was the end. They shoved me to the ground, hit me over the head, and ran away. They probably thought they had knocked me out or at least dazed me enough not to follow them, but given the circumstances, there was no way I was going back towards them. I got up and started jogging in what I hoped was the direction of the interstate running through the forest. As the adrenaline wore off, my head started pounding, and it was hard to think straight. It was pitch black, and I kept stumbling over fallen logs and tree roots, unsure if I was even walking in a straight line. After about 30 minutes, I passed out, likely from a mix of exhaustion and the blow to my head. When I regained consciousness, I had even less idea of which way to go. I walked in what I prayed was the right direction, knowing I could just be getting more lost. After an hour of seeing nothing but trees and darkness, I spotted a light in the distance. It was a flashlight, moving around as if someone was carrying it. I shouted for help, only to see the figure turn towards me and shine the light in my direction, with 3 more figures appearing behind him. Panicked, I sprinted away, but they didn't follow me. Though terrifying, this encounter helped me find the right direction. 2 more hours of walking, and at the break of dawn, I reached the interstate. After another half hour, I flagged down a car and was finally safe. Back in the city, I contacted the police, got my car back, and gave the officers the best description of the events I could. I still had to pay for the lost rental items, but that was a minor issue compared to what could have happened. Luckily, the men who robbed and attacked me didn't seem interested in killing me, but leaving me in a vast forest at night was risky enough. Oddly, if I hadn't seen them a second time, as terrifying as it was, I might not have made it out alive. History 2. I was on a road trip returning from a job interview across the states. I stayed a couple of extra days to turn it into a mini vacation, which is why I drove instead of flying. It was pouring outside, usually making for a relaxing drive, but it was the middle of the night, making visibility difficult. Most of the drive took me through dense forest on long 1-lane roads. The drive was supposed to be around 10 hours, and with the rain, I expected a slight delay. It was just past 1 a.m. when I checked my phone and saw it was 62 miles until the next turn. For some reason, Apple Maps was taking me on a different route than the one I'd taken before. I didn't see it as a problem and continued driving for about 30 minutes before glancing at my phone again. It still said I was 62 miles away from the next turn. My car wasn't moving on the map. I tried clicking on it and restarting the app, but it was frozen on that screen. To make things worse, all it said was, "Turn right in 62 miles," with no road or street name. Without that, I had no idea where I was going or when to turn, except for a vague memory of a street name it had shown before. Despite the inconvenience, I continued driving in hopes that it was just an internet connection issue, and that once I was out of the dense forest, it would fix itself. An hour later, I was still in the forest, and the rain was still pouring. I saw an intersection up ahead. On the connecting street, there was a truck parked on the side. I figured they were probably having the same problem I was. I slowed down and looked at the street sign. To my surprise, I thought I actually recognized it. It could have been a coincidence or a false memory due to my lack of sleep, but I decided to turn and take my chances. At first, I was confident, thinking I might have made the right call, but after another hour of driving, I was still in the forest. I knew for sure I hadn't spent nearly this much time driving through the forest on the way there, so something was wrong. I checked my phone again, but still had no luck. Up ahead, I saw the faint glow of a billboard sign. A motel, right in the middle of this isolated forest. It seemed like an odd location for a motel, but I pulled into the parking lot to figure out my situation safely. The whole lot was empty, not a single car. A minute later, the same truck I'd seen back at the intersection pulled in and parked a few spots down. I couldn't see much through the rain, so I ignored them and continued trying to get my phone to work. I probably sat there for 15 minutes before giving up. Just before deciding to go into the motel to ask for help or get a room, a knock on my window startled me. "Hey, can you help me?" he yelled through the rain. I rolled the window down a crack, letting rain splash on me, and asked what he wanted. He said he needed directions and gave me a very specific address, as if I would know where it was. "Sorry, man. I'm just as lost as you are." He frowned, then smiled and said, "Have a nice night," before walking back through the rain to his truck. After a minute, I got out and ran into the motel. The front room was dark and empty, nobody at the desk. I leaned over the counter to see if someone was in the back, but then the front door opened behind me. I turned and saw the man from the truck outside, soaked with water dripping from his long hair and beard. The look on his face was cold and sinister, and he had one hand suspiciously shoved in his pocket. In that instant, I quickly tried to walk past him. He stayed firmly in my way, but for some reason he didn't stop me from squeezing past him and out the door. As I quickly walked to my car, I heard the man exit the building behind me, his footsteps catching up. I got in and turned on my car just as the man came up to my window. Through the rain, I heard my door latch click. Thank goodness my car auto-locks, because as soon as I heard that and looked up at him, he stared at me with disturbingly rage-filled eyes and began forcefully trying to open the door. He was pulling so hard the entire car was rocking back and forth. I pulled out and drove off so fast I almost ran him over. I got back to the intersection and sped down the road I was on before. Thankfully, after 20 miles, I made it to a city and was able to get help. It turned out the motel I was at had closed down a couple of months back, and for some reason the sign still worked, which nobody could explain to me. I don't know what that man's intentions were or whether he had planned that whole thing out, but one thing I am sure of is that I got very lucky with my escape from that motel. History 3. I lived on my own for the first time in my life when I turned 25. This newfound freedom made me want to explore other things by myself too, and one thing I'd always wanted to do was go on a long hike. It might sound a little strange, but it was just something that seemed like a personal achievement to do solo. I had no experience with any outdoorsy activities, so this was my first big trail. Online it said it would take about 8 hours, so I packed as much water and food as I could. On Monday morning, I set out on the hike. The first thing I noticed when I started walking was how narrow the trail was. I didn't know if this was normal, but it was barely wide enough to walk on without stepping off the edges. Despite being thin, it was still well defined, and I figured I'd be back well before dark, so I wasn't too worried. Although I didn't hike much, I was in decent shape, so walking long distances wasn't an issue for me. Most of the way up the trail I felt great and had no problems, but as I kept going it started to wear me down. I checked my watch constantly, and once I was 6 hours in and still hadn't reached the end, I started to worry. The end of the trail was supposed to be a small overlook of the valley, so there was no way I could have just walked past it or missed it. According to the website, I was 2 hours behind. I then started to think that maybe the trail was 8 hours one way and didn't include the walk back. At this point, I knew I had to turn back if I wanted to be out of the forest before dark. I turned around and began walking back the way I came. As I walked back, I noticed a few things I hadn't seen on the way up. Specifically, there was a line of prints that went perpendicular to the path, crossing from one end of the forest to the other and continuing as far as I could see. I thought maybe I didn't see it before because of the different perspective, but I was already worried, and this wasn't helping. 3 hours into the hike back, and nearly 9 hours total in the forest, the trail I was walking on started to widen. One thing I knew for sure was that the trail had been narrow the entire time up, so when I saw this, my stomach tightened. I didn't know how, but I had gotten onto the wrong trail, maybe taking a side path accidentally. I stood there, terrified for a few minutes, unsure of my next move. The sun was already setting, and if I had taken the wrong turn in daylight, how would I find my way back in the dark? My choices were limited, so I turned back again and hoped for the best. I started walking, but not long after, I saw footprints again, not the same ones from before, and I knew these weren't there just 10 minutes ago. I looked into the forest in the direction they were going, but it was too dark to see much. Soon I couldn't see anything. The moonlight provided a dim glow, but I hadn't packed a flashlight. It was the middle of April, so the nights got pretty cold where I lived. As I walked, the only sound was my footsteps on the gravel and the soft noises of the forest. That was until I heard something ahead, someone else walking on the gravel. I stopped and stared into the dark, but after a few steps, the sound went away. I carefully moved forward until I saw the footprints in the gravel going straight across the trail. I turned my phone light on and pointed it into the forest. It was still too dim, but I knew someone was out there. "Hello!" I called out, but there was nothing but silence. I held my phone light up, and after a moment, I saw a slight fog from someone's cold breath rise from behind a nearby tree. They were maybe 10 feet away from me into the forest, but seeing as they were hiding made me scared of what they were up to and why they didn't want to be seen. I quickly walked further down the trail, and after 30 minutes, I found where I had accidentally turned off. Several hours later, I made it out and got to my car. I hated myself for weeks after that for having gotten myself into such a bad situation, but it only got worse. I think it was exactly 3 weeks after my hike when I saw on the news that 2 bodies were found in the forest I had hiked in. They didn't give exact locations, but it was in the area near the trail I had taken. I don't think they found who did it, but I'm almost positive that at one point I was standing just 10 feet away from them, close enough to see their cold breath in the dark.